Hi everyone. In the past and in some of the feedback that I've received on all my videos, one of the things that has many people have asked is to talk about CI/CD and some GitOps, and I'm just going to go over that for you. So CI/CD is basically, you must be knowing, it's continuous integration and continuous delivery. So when we talk about CI/CD in the past, it's basically your for application development and software. When the code is checked in, you can have a repo, which can be any repo, right? Bitbucket or Git, and then the code gets as soon as when the code is checked in, right? And then it's the your typical, when you're using an IDE, it will build the code, and then the code gets deployed. So now when we're talking about containers, the as part of the code build, the images form image is constructed. So there will be a base image, and on top of that we add whatever libraries we want, and then finally you have your, if you're using Java, your jars or wars. If you're using Python, then your Python code and whatever libraries you need, that gets embedded on top of, as multiple layers of that container. And then that's sorry, the image. So the one whole image has all this information, and the image, when that gets pushed into a repo. Now that repo is basically a registry, a image registry like Artifactory or Docker registry or ECR or GCR, right? So it gets pushed in there, and when it has to be deployed, that's basically the deployment YAMLs, which we talk about, the manifests. They get deployed into the environment. So that all works fine as long as we're talking about code and software. Now what comes next is the IaC, which is infrastructure as code. So when we are before we are deploying applications onto, now in the case of containers, we're talking about Kubernetes, right? So we're talking about setting up, it's not just plain VMs, we're talking about setting up clusters and where these pods can be run. So for that we so to build a cluster, right, even if it's managed by a vendor, for example EKS or Anthos, right, still there is a lot of stuff that still is needed on the end of a platform engineer to be able to set up the cluster, which means that you have to add the node groups, you have to add the worker. So first you have to create the cluster control plane, right? That's one step. Then you have to add the worker nodes, then you have to add other things on top of it. For example, if you're using tools such as your cluster should have Splunk, your cluster should have Dynatrace and other tools. All those need to be installed. So to build a cluster before the application can get deployed, you don't want to be uh, doing it manually. So it has to be, so IAC comes in picture, where it's basically having your infrastructure as a code, which means you keep all the configuration, the infrastructure configuration information as code. So all those YAML files, everything is a manifest, right? So all those manifests get into checked in, they're all a part of a repo. And now when these are the ones that get deployed. So to even to build the cluster, it has to be exactly coming from the YAML, so that the same kind of environment can be built multiple times. So that every time you build a cluster, it shouldn't be that, oh, it's different than the previous one, or there are some changes in the configuration. So the config files are the same, which are like templates and manifests, and the only changes will be definitely, cluster name or some kind of capacity and stuff like that. So that's where IAC, which is very popular, is called infrastructure as code. And before IAC, there's also something called as GitOps. So GitOps is basically it's kind of a framework, and that helps in provisioning of infrastructure. So basically, it's Git and operations, right? So it's basically we use a Git repository as a single source of truth for all these infrastructure manifests, and then that's where and because of keeping it into a repo, it's also tracked, versioning is controlled, everything is controlled. So in this one of the very popular tool out there is Terraform. So what is Terraform, right? So Terraform is um, Terraform came out with it basically it automates infrastructure, and it's part of HashiCorp. HashiCorp, um, Vault and HashiCorp, a lot of products are very popular. So basically, Terraform is again as it's IAC tool, which will it can help us build, change, and then keep the versions of the files. And only with a couple of commands, as you see, right, you'll be able to build the whole infrastructure. So for example, so I have provided a link where it has more information, but at a high level, what it does, it your code is, all those YAML files are saved in Git, and it has a structure like modules. We can add multiple modules. For example, in an EKS cluster, you can have module for worker for the node groups, and then it works through variables. So anything which is dynamic can be passed as a variable, and these are all Terraform files. And finally, the main components over here, as you see, are basically those configuration files, and there is a Terraform state file. So configuration files are the files which are required to build up, I will say infrastructure, or basically that's a cluster, I will say, in the case of here. But and Terraform state file is what keeps the state, so that is very important. It keeps the state of the cluster, and every class, every init, right, when you're and every apply has to have a state saved somewhere. Otherwise, you will never be able to because if you want, if after building the cluster there are some changes needed, then you can update the input variables, and then you can again run a Terraform apply, or plan is basically to see. So init is to initialize, and you can see plan, it will show you what changes it's going to make, and then you can do an apply. So then it will only make the change which is like a delta from the past state. So if the state is lost, then there's no way to do any changes. And then Terraform has something called as providers, so it works with lot of providers. um, it works with a bunch of providers, as you see here, and these are the providers basically which will help build the infrastructure. So if you're using, for example, in the case of EKS, if you're building EKS cluster using Terraform, then I will use like AWS, one of the providers, and it has a providers. We can use providers.terraform file, or it can be a part of the main manifest. So it's basically how you design your architecture. So I am actually here installing Terraform on my local machine. So if you see, I gave it's Terraform brew. Because I have a Mac, so I'm using brew install, and I will just go up and show my command. I did a brew install. Um, this one I had to do install GCC, but I just did a simple brew install. This one, brew install HashiCorp tap Terraform, and then now it's running. So this will install Terraform on my local Mac. Brew install GCC. So I have to do that. It's complaining, but basically I'm going to come back when I have installed Terraform, and I'm going to then I can do a simple. We can have some create some Terraform files, and then use it to deploy like a object on AWS, maybe like a create S3 bucket or something, like a simple example.